Yeah, you get pretty efficient at it. Ah. Yeah, totally. Blame it on. Feel free. I'll take full responsibility. No, or I can go on. No. Yeah, I can see where it is. No. There it is. Yeah, and so it's all one piece. All right.
Is there coffee somewhere? Is it? Oh, I see the side over there for coffee. Oh, candy. No, I thought it said coffee. How you doing? So, who convinced you to spend that 18 months? Who convinced you to go to America?
Nobody. In fact, I've had to convince my wife to let me keep doing it.
Oh, really? Yeah, I was going to say, I had a COVID here. I was about 3 minutes.
Yeah, well,
if you ever want to kiss.
I don't know if you remember, but I had it super long, and
yeah, you did.
I went the opposite.
So, are you part of Timber's Army now? Or
No.
You get stopped? Do you wear a plaid shirt on the street?
I mean, I was too late for that already. I'm trying to convince myself to grow it long enough to do the locks of love or whatever. So.
50 years.
We'll see. We'll see. I don't know.
Oh, it's called.
Something I need to raise it up a little bit.
Hey, it's good. Barb's over in Berlin, the Berlin family, and just provided. Groceries for the last year and a half. Getting in groceries each week, our institute to take care of the building. And that's what boss has to do that. They're doing good. Probably got to see them. And I had to see them.
That'll work. You can see it.
How are you?
All right. You guys ready? Let me make sure I got audio on the stream. Yep, we're good to go. Boom.
Now, when you're doing this,
Yeah.
is live,
Yeah.
is it also recorded?
Yeah.
So we can pull it up later.
Yeah.
While you're watching it.
Absolutely.
So what can you just go to your.
Go to the website.
Go to the website.
Yep. Jill, thank you, Jill, wherever she ran off to, has been making sure all this stuff shows up on the website.
Okay.
Extremely helpful. Extremely nice. I don't want to subscribe. I'm already subscribed to your newsletter. Don't ask me again. Sorry. That was forceful. Don't talk to you. It doesn't understand it, but they do now. That's the creepy part.
Yeah.
That thing listens to me nonstop. Thank you, Joe. Oh, man. Well, it's more for, be careful what you say because it'll show up on your advertisements next. That's how it works now. Okay, so let's catch up. So this is week 2 of Native Peoples of the Pacific Northwest. Last week we did kind of an overview of what to expect over the next indeterminate amount of time, however long we cover this. We also did kind of a brief overview of the whole timeline of the peoples as well too. So what we're going to do today is try to begin to paint the picture of what life looked like at, let's say, 1650, for just a totally random guess. But long story short, pre-European influence, right? So I talked last week about how that's difficult from a historical perspective because of various factors. One of the big things, of course, is that there aren't, because so many people died due to disease and other factors between the arrival of European settlers and the establishment of the tribal reservations, a lot of the oral history got lost. And again, these are oral history peoples, no written stuff. So in terms of laying out what an actual history, it's tough. What we do have, however, are lots of archaeological sites. So believe it or not, Oregon has a wealth of native sites that archaeologists and historians and others have spent time in. And this book, if anybody wants a really dense book but has a ton of interesting information, I encourage you to pick this one up. It wasn't cheap. I don't remember what I paid for it. I got it from Chinook and Peoples of the Lower Columbia. And what's fascinating about this is it's written from a pseudo-academic perspective, but they mix the academic language with plain speak, if that makes sense. With lay people terminology, right? So the way that each section kind of goes is what they'll do is they'll talk about what they've learned from the archaeological evidence, and then they'll actually present the archaeological evidence. So I only read up to that point, and then my eyes kind of glaze over, and I skip to the summary conclusion, because I don't know anything about archaeology, and they're showing like confidence diagrams and all kinds of stuff that don't mean a whole lot to me. But this is a fantastic book, and so we have been able to, now when I say we, I'm using the royal we here. I haven't done anything here. But archaeologists have managed to piece together essentially a picture of what life looked like pre-European arrival. And it's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. It's fascinating for a couple of reasons. One is because if you're a history person or anthropology, archaeology person, it's just fascinating because of that. It's also fascinating because, and we talked about this last week, because it's so unique relative to the rest of the native peoples of the continental United States, right? I mean, to be fair, you could make that argument about, you could say the Plains Indians are fascinating because they're unique relative to, which is true as well too. But one of the things we talked about last week, and I continue to find fascinating, is because of the geography of the Pacific Northwest, and because of take Western Oregon, for example, because you essentially have natural isolation created by the two mountain ranges, you get not only unique cultures and identities in those various regions, you get unique languages, right? So that was one of the things that we talked about. So I'm going to bring that. So this is an older map that has been revised. You notice they've crossed out Indian. It just says tribes and languages. So this site is the Five Oaks Museum site, which I can't remember how that was organized. Well, I don't need to go into this right now. I'll remember it toward the end and we'll talk about it. But this is awesome. And I think I ranted about this last week. It's a fantastic site from just for like general information, like this is a great place to start if you're curious about what we're talking about at all. So like for fiveoaksmuseum.org, it's a native created site as well too. So this is not something that, for example, the Portland Art Museum or whoever has put together on behalf of. This is created by the Grand Ronde and I think other tribes or other reservations. Speaking of, let's talk about that real quick. Okay, so when we talk about tribe, that's a word that we're using to describe something that may or may not exist. Okay, what I mean by this is, again, when we talk about the Plains Indians, by and large, you get larger socio-political groups, right? So what we mean by this is we get larger groups of people who share something in common but have, in some way, shape, or form, common leadership, or, and that especially in terms of the Plains Indians, that may just be a confederation of smaller tribes. So when we refer to the Nez Perce or the Cherokee or any of those folks, realistically speaking, it's probably more similar to the tribe, the nation of Israel, wherein it described a confederation of tribes, right? When we talk about the Pacific Northwest, tribe doesn't actually fit anymore. When we use the word tribe to describe the Pacific Northwest, what we're talking about is groups of people that share a common language. So, for example, when we talk about the Kalapuya, they are not a unified group of people in any way, shape, or form, except that they all spoke a version of a common language. And I'll show that language map again in a little bit. And a perfect example of this is even within the area, which is now the Forest Grove, Tualatin, coastal range area, there were 3 different brands of Kalapuya that was spoken within that area. And there aren't firm boundaries either, because if you just go north towards the Columbia River, then you're running into the Chinookan people who spoke what we refer to as Chinookan. So, and here's the fascinating thing is, and I was reading a bit about this in this book this morning, is that, for example, Chinook was the term that was applied by the European settlers because they ran into a tribe who referred to themselves, we call them a tribe. They ran into a village which referred to itself as the Chinook people, okay? And the European settlers heard it and said, oh, this is the land of the Chinookan people. But it wasn't. That word only applied to that village. In fact, everybody else called themselves something different. Each village was its own separate identity. But we just said, oh, this is the land of the Chinookan people, because that's how our minds worked, right? So in 17th, 18th century Western Europe, you had large national understandings. I mean, nationalism wasn't actually a thing yet, but you had large, feudal whatever. You had large, villages combined together to form greater things. That was not the setting here, where you had, again, the things that tied people together were language. But you have the Chinookan people, again, we refer to them, along the Columbia, the mouth of the Columbia, all the way down into the Willamette even, that were right next to, relatively speaking, the Kalapuya people, okay? They shared common language in that they spoke some of each other's language as well, too. But relatively, they were culturally independent to a certain regard, because the Chinookan people were salmon fishers. They harvested salmon. The Kalapuya people would trade with the Chinookan people for salmon, and they would trade with the coastal people for shellfish and other sea creatures. But they were, by and large, hunter-gatherer peoples that lived off of, we'll talk about this in a little bit, Wapato. They lived off of camas root. They lived off of small rodents that would eat, that would get into their Wapato pond areas to eat the Wapato. They would live off of elk and deer when they could find it. And they would trade these goods with the Chinookan people. So they would, whether they had a common trader language that they all spoke or whatever. But again, the largest socio-political unit was not a tribe, it was a village, also referred to as a household. Jim, you've got a question.
Is it a family village?
More than that. So the term that Boyd, Ames, and Johnson use is household, okay? Within a household, there would be a given number of family units. depending on the size of the household, up to 14 families in a household was usually max that they found. But average was somewhere between, it could be 2, it could be 10, somewhere in that area. In each family unit, so polygamy was a thing, but wasn't the norm, okay? And so each family unit usually consisted of a couple with a number of children, plus slaves, okay? So we talked a little briefly about this last week, but slavery was a practice in the Pacific Northwest, all the way up and down the area. And remind me, but I'll get to that later. Sorry, there's a kid on a tricycle with a huge flag sticking up, and all I could see was the flag. And I'm like, what is going on out there? Anyways, I'm easily distracted, as you all know. But what I was going to say is the people that we now associate with what's now the Tuaut area refer to themselves as the Atfalati, okay? Which if you go on and look at this is Kalapuya Land website, the Five Oaks Museum website, fine. Now, here's an interesting thing too, is we can look at the etymology of what we now refer to as Oregon. And these are kind of guesses because somehow, somewhere, the word Oregon began to apply to this ground. And so they're not 100% sure on where the name comes from, but there are a couple of options. So, for example, they wonder perhaps it originates from the word for storm, which is ouragan in French. Perhaps that was where the name came from. Or perhaps it was from the word for smoked and dried fish, which was one of the primary trade goods, especially for the Chinookan people, which was ooligan, which could have been Oregon as well too. Okay, so these are just fascinating, interesting things. And if you go on here, you can look at what the original names were. So, for example, Willamette River is actually pretty close. It was originally called the Willamette, which means to pour or spill out water, because the Willamette was a tributary feeding into the Columbia, et cetera, et cetera. And the Columbia itself was, and I'm guessing at these pronunciations. I do not speak Chinookwawa, which I'll talk about a little bit as well too. But it's a Nichiwana, something like that, meaning the big river. And so all these places obviously had original names, and what's fascinating as well too is that they're discovering that they used common names, right? So it wasn't that everybody called the river a different thing. Like everybody that lived along the Willamette referred to it as Chiwana, So cool stuff. Okay, I wanted to show you the language maps. I have to pull this up. Sorry. Touchscreens are the best thing ever. I should have opened this up ahead of time. So this is the map I showed you last week, and I know that the font is super small. It's almost impossible to see from where you're at. But the area that we're going to talk about today is up here. So the north end of the Kalapuya land and basically the area to the east of Sauvie Island, okay, leading up to the Willamette. That is the primary site that these folks did their work on. So basically, along Highway 30, all the way up to the meeting point of the Willamette and the Columbia. That's where they found these sites. So we're actually talking about a diverse group of people, but an important piece, especially as it bears importance to us, is that included the Clackamas Indians, after which our county gained its name. And one of the things I mentioned last week as well too is that these maps are all guesstimations. Obviously, they didn't keep maps in this way. And so when we talk about when we talk about households, right, which was the largest socio-political thing, right? So that's the largest grouping of people who all saw themselves under common leadership. They weren't in fixed places. So for the Chinookan people, especially, the way that their lives worked is that the majority of the year they would spend their time along the river. So there were 3 major salmon runs that occurred during this day and age. And this is mostly coming from archaeological evidence because it's changed somewhat in the modern era. I mean, it's still similar, but it's still different. So February to June was the first salmon run of the year. There was a celebration that they had. There was the first salmon celebration that they would hold in February or March. Was literally whenever they caught the first salmon. So February to June was the first salmon spawning. June to September, and September to November or something like that. I can't remember. Their permanent residence, however, was not at their fishing grounds. Their permanent residence would have been inland by as much as 25 to 50 miles. Reason being is because during the winter, when there are no salmon spawning, they need access to different food sources, right? Now, granted, what they're doing over the course of the year is actually catching as many fish as they possibly can to dry, to preserve, so that they've got a store of food through the winter. But during the winter, they're also harvesting camas root, they're harvesting wapato, they're potentially the Chinookan tribes were also harvesting elk and deer and other animals as well too, but they would be trading as well with the Kalapulia people and potentially the coastal people as well too for goods that they needed. I mean, it's really sad that we can't go back in time, because I think it would be fascinating to kind of see how the economy worked in this region, to see how the trading went back and forth. So let's and stop me at any point. If I get so excited about this stuff, it ends up coming out like a fire hose. But you can see here, that's the Multnomah people, after which Multnomah County takes its name, and the Clackamas are just down to the right, and modern day Portland is up here, right? So that's our area. Let me collect my thoughts. Was I going to talk fish next? Yeah, let's talk fish. Do you guys know what wapato is? Have you heard this name before? Wapato is a root. It's a aquatic plant, okay, that grows in ponds or other bodies of water, and it is a tuber that, when harvested, it basically functions as a potato. So the wapato, camas root, and red cedar were the three what we refer to as keystone resources. Have you heard that term before? So these are the three resources that were basically the subsistence pieces. They allowed life to thrive in this area. So wapato and camas were both carbohydrate and other carbohydrate sources, which you can live on carbohydrates, right? Like Southeast Asia is a perfect example of that. But then they also were huge sources of riboflavin, thiacin, a bunch of other important vitamins is the word I was looking for. Okay, red cedar they used for everything. Red cedar is what they built their canoes out of. Red cedar is red cedar bark is what they wove baskets out of. They wove huts and screens and clothes, and their clothes were cedar clothes. So wapato, camas root, and camas is a prairie tuber, and red cedar are the three things that allowed life to thrive. Because again, salmon don't spawn year-round. They've only got access to them for these few times. Doesn't matter how much food you save up, you need something to support your diet other than just the sources. Especially if some strange weather phenomenon happens that messes up the salmon runs. Here's how they process wapato and camas. Wapato, they would literally grill. So they would put it on hot coals, like you would do, potatoes over I've done it before, wrap the potato up in tinfoil, throw it in the campfire. Obviously, they didn't have tinfoil, so they would throw it on directly, and they pull the charred skin off and eat it like you would a potato. And apparently, they're delicious if you want that type of thing. Camas root, however, was a little tougher, and they would bake it for days. So what they would do is they'd make an underground stove, essentially, dump a whole pile of camas root in there, cover it up, bake it for 2 to 5 days, pull it out, shape it into loaves, and then eat it like that. So imagine something that I'm thinking. They try to describe it. I'm guessing it's something more along the lines of a turnip or that kind of root vegetable, but it's shaped like a loaf of bread almost. Yeah. Questions? What's that? Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally. That's a good comparison. So, yeah. So let's talk fish, because this is, after all, the single organism that really kind of shaped the culture of this area as well too. So I'll retell the story, because why not? I mean, I already told it like 15 times, but I like telling stories again. So one of the books I'm reading which is, I think it's called Indians of the Pacific Northwest by Valoria Jr. Some of you guys have already heard this. So he talks about the reason that he ends up writing this history, because he primarily wrote about the Plains Indians. That was his focus. He's not from the Pacific Northwest. He got invited by members of the Grand Ronde Reservation to come out and write about, or not members of the Grand Ronde. No, it was members of the Lumi tribe, I think, up in Puget Sound. They ended up meeting in Portland. So they wrote to him and said, "Hey, we'd love for you to do a history on an Indian-written history on the Native peoples of the Pacific Northwest, as opposed to this, which is very much anthropological, archaeological, white perspective and stuff." And he said, "Why?" Because he's like, you really don't have a cohesive tribal identity. There's not, there aren't many of you left. I don't know that there's enough to put together to make a history. And they said, "Well, we'd love it if you come out and visit." So they flew him out to Portland. They met him in Portland, picked him up, drove him to, I think, one of the reservations for a salmon cookout. And they said, you need to this is how you're going to understand who we are, is by, eating salmon with us. So he sits down for the meal, and of course there's a little fillet of salmon sitting on his plate. I don't remember, maybe some camas root or some wabato was put in there as well too, to make a traditional meal out of it. And he's like, "Oh, this is delicious," but again, I'm still not really understanding what you're talking about. So then they grabbed him, and they took him back into the kitchen where somebody was prepping a salmon. And then, of course, there's a Chinook salmon over 1 meter long that's sitting on this table. And he looks at it, and he talks about how his brain broke. Because, one of the complaints that he has, for the Plains Indians, we had the buffalo. That was the thing that united us culturally and united our cultural identity. This is something that really shaped who we are. He's like, "I just don't see that." And they said, "Well, we have the salmon." He had grown up, eating brook trout and panfish, and he had no comprehension of this. So he goes back and they show him the salmon, and he's like, "Oh, that's your buffalo." Yes. So, what's your experience with salmon?
Well, when we first moved here, and,
Yeah, Texas. Yeah. So unless you're fishing marlins.
that was when they were allowing the Indians to sell off their trucks around,
Cascade Locks.
So we're driving, and we see one of these trucks, and I thought David was with it, Carolyn, and we said, "Let's stop and see what they're carrying." It was like $2 a pound, something like that, which was cheap. And I said, "Well, I'll take a small one." Well, he brings out this big one. I said, "No, I want a small one." And he said, "Come here, lady." He gets me up on his truck to look at the bins. They're all
That was
on that side. He said, "This is a small one."
Yeah.
Then I get it home and realize it had been cleaned, but that's it.
Yeah.
And you try to cut that thing up, you need a hatchet and a
Yeah.
hammer,
Yeah.
and it took us all day
To process the
to
salmon.
process it.
Yeah. Sure, David was
So
thrilled.
It's worth the $6 now just to go to the grocery store again.
Yeah, right. That's amazing. Yeah. Yeah, so you can understand how Vine Deloreal Jr. probably felt when he was shown his first Chinook salmon. So fishing was life, especially for the Chinookan people. And not just for the Chinookan people. I mean, so you can keep going, right? All the way up past Cascade Locks, all the way up past where the modern dam is, even up to the Dalles, and families, households would have ancestral fishing sites on either side of the river. And we're only seeing the Oregon side of this. If we flipped over to the Washington perspective as well too, you could see that there are tribes that are clustered, tribes, for lack of a better word, that are clustered along the north shore of the Columbia River. So again, hugely central to the identity. Now here's the fascinating thing, is that in actuality, they didn't always eat just salmon, okay? So there were 4 fish groups that they ate. Salmon kind of being the creme de la creme, right? Like when salmon were spawning and when they could fish salmon, that was amazing, and of course they celebrated that. Much of their ceremony, their ritual was built around the salmon. Not this week, probably next week, assuming I'm not in France, I'll show you a video of the salmon dance. It's really cool. They teach all the little kids to do it. And that's something that they've been doing for centuries. But there's four. The problem is I start talking, I name 4 groups, and I go off on a tangent, and I can't remember what I was talking about. So 4 groups. So salmon is kind of at the top, so to speak. Sturgeon is another big food group that they harvested. And smelt, believe it or not. Smelt being a source of food. Did you already know this, deity? Oh, never mind. It was an inside joke. Smelt being a whole different, being a source of food for these larger fish, of course. And so what they would do is they would actually encourage pools of smelt to gather in their fishing areas because they knew if there were pools of smelt, that would mean that eventually there's going to be sturgeon, eventually there's going to be salmon in that area as well too. But they would eat the smelt as well. I love smelt. I think they're delicious. If you can get over the idea of eating a whole fish. I don't know. Luckily, I got introduced to that as a child, so it never seemed weird to me.
When I was teaching in Riverside School way back in the 70s and 80s, they were very common for people to eat smelt. You don't hear that anymore.
I don't know that there's as much smelt anymore. Same is true in the Midwest.
I don't remember kindergarten or first grade, but a little boy, somebody said as we were having gathering group, something smells bad. And I had to say, oh, no, that's fine.
Yeah.
It'll go away. Knowing farewell, I was going to get the answer if I didn't.
Yeah.
The little hand went up and this little guy says, this is what I think it might be me because we had smelt for lunch.
Oh my gosh.
And somebody said it smells bad.
Oh no. Yeah, that's great. That's adorable. Yeah, we used to go to the Crow's Nest, which was like the almost fine dining restaurant in Alpena, Michigan. That's very tongue-in-cheek, by the way. And that was our treat every once in a while. We get a smelt dinner, which was smelt that was breaded and fried with tartar sauce, of course, in the true American fashion. And then we'd always get a kitty cocktail, which was awesome because then you'd get an umbrella that came with your drink. Surely, yeah. I don't know if we knew what. Anyways, it was just a kitty cocktail to us. And then we got to the point where we weren't kids anymore, but we still weren't old enough to have real cocktails. So then it was just Coke or Sprite. Anyways, that has nothing to do with this. So smelt, but then the other shellfish. Now, not a whole ton of shellfish, except remember that they would trade significantly with the coastal tribes as well too. So those 4 are kind of the aquatic biodiversity that made up their diet. Now, as with anything, they processed these animals in tons of different ways. Whether it's drying, eating fresh. Again, didn't have tons of access to salt, so they aren't going to do what we do, curing in modern ways, smoking, all different ways that they practiced in order to preserve fish through the winter. But every fish, every salmon run, 1 of the 3 out of the year, they would get as much as they could. And sorry, I need lunch soon. I'm starting to run out of juice. One of the things that was quoted in here, because they do intersperse the archaeological stuff with some historical interviews. So, this is one of the neat things is that despite the numbers of attrition, there are still some folks who have been able to pass on memories dating all the way back to pre-European settlement or in the midst of European settlement. They talked about how back in the day, which means a totally different thing for them, a single person could expect to catch 20 salmon in an hour, right? Yeah, imagine that. And all the salmon being a meter or larger, that was the standard size, which of course is different in the modern era. And the way that they fished, they had 2 main methods. One was they would actually build platforms out into the river, and they would use gaff hooks to hook the fish and pull them up. And the other was that they made large nets out of woven red cedar bark that they would drop into the water, and then it's a pretty complicated process then to be able to this one involved many people then, because what they would do is essentially the salmon would swim and get caught in the net, and then they kind of pull the bottom up essentially and lift the whole thing out of the river. But a single person with a single gaff hook could expect to catch 20 salmon in an hour, which mind blowing. And you can imagine how this shaped their identity, shaped their culture, shaped their practice, because when the salmon are spawning, you do nothing else for however many days you've got access to those fish. But keep in mind, just because of the sheer lack of number of people, because I mean this is going to turn into an anthropological pondering, but now we're living in an urban setting where we can support upwards of 1 million people in one given place. We're talking less than 100,000 people that are living in this area in total. So it's mind-blowing to us that they can catch 20 salmon an hour. That seems excessive. But when you've only got, maybe 600 people just in this area of that area there, they're not overfishing. They never have to worry about overfishing, right? Because the amount of people that are supporting is so exponentially fewer than what we're talking about, which is why, we talked about this last week. This continues to be one of the major issues: is fishing rights that are established in treaties, and why they are so insistent on protecting these fishing rights. Because it's two things. It's not just about these tribes being able to do their ancestral practice, which is fishing. It's care for creation as well, which is saying that there need to be salmon in the river because this is the natural order of things. And if we're fishing too many salmon out, or if our environmental practices are killing the salmon, something's wrong with the natural order. And we're going to leverage our treaty rights to protect those native species, if that makes sense. Any questions thus far? Sorry, again, water out of a fire hose.
Well, it probably didn't help, smart people started putting up dams.
Yeah, I mean and for those of you that were around during that time, that was a very controversial piece, which meant the tribes still is. The tribes fought extensively because it essentially killed an entire section of the Columbia River in terms of, which they then ameliorated, which they then changed by, some of the things that they've done with the dam to allow salmon to spawn up down the river. I don't know Mark Corsness would be a great person to talk to because he works for Bonneville Power and Electric, but I don't have a firm grasp on the history of it. But yes, absolutely. Changed the landscape there as well too. But even prior to that, so even 200 years prior to that, this was a source of conflict between the European settlers and the native peoples, just because the European settlers would come in with boats, and they were loading up boats with salmon to take other places. And there was no sense of we're catching this to feed ourselves. This was we're taking back a boat full of salmon to trade with these folks to do these things. I mean, it's a conflict of capitalism, or not even pre-capitalism, but it's a conflict of capitalism with Northwest sensibility.
Just kind of insight as far as, dams. Bonneville, last 5-10 years I've worked with Bonneville was spending more money on salmon habitat we have than transmission lines and substations.
Sure.
It was a massive amount of money.
Yeah.
Because a lot of our lines went through private land. There was this anyway, it was a lot of work. And being done.
Yeah, and that's why Bonneville is supplying a need that is, Portland doesn't exist without Bonneville Power and Electric, right? So, in no way, shape, or form do I want to malign Bonneville, not as a corporation, but as the people who are involved in it. But I'm certainly glad that they're doing that work in the modern era. But even, let me rant for just a minute. This is one of the things I think is important for us to ponder, is that so often it's easy to say, well, for example, it's that awful dam, right? But we never really question what the fact that dam supplies power, etc., to that allows us to live our quality of life. So rather than saying, oh, the dam, we have to ask ourselves, which is, the reason I'm bringing this up is because this is one of the things that we're eventually going to talk about with regards to kind of like native philosophy is it's our quality of life that makes that dam necessary. So don't we all actually have a share in the blame for it? So that's my rant.
So it was two different cultures, different subsistence.
Yes.
And building an economy is.
Yes. And this is, and I
That's the big one.
And I can't wait to talk about. I can't wait till we get to this point because it's really easy. And I'm always hesitant. I always want to be wary of this. It's really easy to demonize and say, oh, we're you know, not that we don't have, not that we as a culture don't deserve it often, but it's really easy to just say, oh, we're you know we're in the environment. We're we killed all the tribes. We did all these things, right? I think it's much more helpful and much more informative to say and to help us understand, like, well, you know, what's the difference, for example, between an industrialized society and a native society, and what are the effects of industrial, you know, not just industrialization, but the effects of, for example, a modern standard of living, right? How do we support something like this? If we were all to practice subsistence living, this region would not support all of us. Plain and simple, right? Now, granted, there are as technology progresses, we can have gardens, we can do all these great things. Like for those of you that have victory gardens during World War II, we can do things to help take a load off of the food economy. The reality is, if you're going to have, I don't know what the population of Portland is now, if you're going to have that many people living in this geographical area, we can't support ourselves in subsistence living, right? Doesn't work. So in terms of like, you know, is that bad or good? Well, it's the reality. So a better question is how can we do it better? What can we learn from how the native peoples lived to do better with what we have? Just beating ourselves up over and over just doesn't feel good. Absolutely, we have. Yeah. Yeah.
Everybody was trying to plan.
Yeah.
So it comes from somewhere.
And we're, yeah, and I'm blessed to have a huge backyard that I can plant things in. And I'm blessed to have been raised in a family that we have been farmers and gardeners and stuff like that. You know, so in that regard, you know, I have maybe a small advantage, but yeah, everybody's got a garden. Can't get the seeds anymore. Yeah, can't get the plants anymore. Yeah, and well, never mind. We're gonna talk about our neighbors that grow marijuana, but it's a different story. Okay, I only want to go like 5 or 10 more minutes because I'm gonna run out of juice here pretty soon, and you all will too. But I did want to go back to one thing, which I was talking about the two areas of living, right? So family household is the largest socio-political unit, meaning, you know, again, common leadership. So one household, as I mentioned, could have upwards of 14 families. But again, they had two regions of living. So the Chinookan people especially, during the winter, lived by and large in a common house. So you would find, this is where the archaeological stuff comes in, you would find these large, long homes that they had built that would house potentially all these families. Now, of course, when you have maybe 14 families making up a household unit, you might have 2 or 3 of these large buildings. But for most of them, what you had was one large building that was subdivided by separators, where each family had a sleeping platform, right? And I mean, such a different way of life is that a family all slept together, right? They had a raised platform that was built off the ground that they would put their furs, hides, whatever that they slept on, probably blankets, maybe made out of red cedar bark, you know. And that was their unit, and it was essentially walled off by a screen or whatever from the rest of it. But then there was one large communal cooking area that they would be in. So from the months of potentially October through February, they were all living in this common space together. And it was family units and slaves all in one space. Now, when the Salmon Runs started, then they would disperse. So they wouldn't move the entire household unit to one spot. What they would do then is each family within the larger household unit had they either had a semi-permanent dwelling built in the fishing area, or they had mobile tents or whatever that they would take down with them. So when the salmon were running, they didn't move as a unit. They would disperse. Each would go to their own little fishing area. Each family had their ancestral fishing grounds, which was a form of wealth, right? So that was the way that they passed on wealth from father to son to et cetera, was they inherited their family's fishing territory. But again, it wouldn't just be a son inheriting it, Oftentimes it was several families then that would be fishing on the family fishing plot. But then as soon as the salmon run stopped, they would pick up everybody, move back to the thing, and that's where they all lived together. I want to close out. So I mentioned that I would talk about slavery. So this is, this could be a much longer anthropological assessment. The history of slavery and humanity is a fascinating thing. Slavery being something that has been practiced in pretty much every culture at one point or another. Slavery was a reality. Who were the slaves that lived in their households? They were, by and large, with some very few exceptions, non-Chinookans. Okay, so it was folks that lived outside of their cultural territory, and they probably weren't Kalapuians either. Best guess, and again, they really have no way to determine this other than archaeological record. The folks who were slaves were folks that were coming in from the southern Malala Range, or, and this probably would have been pretty rare because there wasn't a whole lot of crossing of the Cascades, folks from the Burns Paiute or the Paiute area, or Tenino folks up in that direction. In other words, it was not them. And how did they know that it was not them? It's because the peoples of this region practiced head flattening. So, head flattening. What they would do is they would confine an infant's head for the first year of life. So babies were basically put in kind of like a bassinet with these head flattening devices, and didn't come out of that bassinet except for cleaning and, they'd say in the bassinet for feeding, cleaning and other thing, cleansing, sorry, would be a proper, when they dirtied their diaper or whatever. But they practiced head flattening. Why? One was potentially it was a standard of beauty. The other was it was the way that they established themselves as distinct people from those around them. Right? Where did it come from? Was this something that came out of this area, or was it introduced by peoples from a long way? We have no idea. but this is one thing that we do know for sure was that they practiced it. So it was subtly different than what you might see in South and Central America, where in those areas they were doing head flattening to produce more of like a conical head. They were actually literally compressing the top of the skull in order to make a broader face, if you can imagine that. So they had slaves, and slaves were just laborers, okay? They weren't in chains. Slaves essentially were people that did the hard work, but they were fed, they slept with the family, they lived in the area. There is a lot of debate over how slaves were treated. So you might hear, even in Lewis and Clark's writings, they write how the slaves that were kept by the Chinookan people were treated like their own children. Okay, there's another guy who, in his journal writing, says almost the complete opposite. So in terms of how their lives were lived, we really don't have a good understanding. The one thing that they do know, which might be indicative, is that more often than not, slaves were not buried with everybody else. They were buried separately. There was some social mobility that was possible. So, for example, slaves were allowed to have children only with other slaves. They weren't allowed to, by and large, they weren't allowed to integrate into the larger society. But the way that you knew that family, and it might have been a family of slaves that had been with this other family for generations, you know that they were allowed to integrate because they would let the slaves' children have their heads flattened. That was how they were integrated now, and then they just became part of that family unit. They were no longer, their progeny were no longer slaves.
It's sort of like in the Bible when
Yeah.
when they came over to Egypt and became slaves.
Yeah, and integrated there as well too. Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me not to do it, but I never cease finding interesting similarities between peoples. So the Hebrew people versus the Chinookan people. We're not all that different as human beings, believe it or not. Jimmy.
I was just wondering, as far as when I studied the Scandinavian history in my
Yeah.
family tree, all right, and would a tenant farmer, some people might say would be like a slave because they
Could-
basically
it's a
care for
pretty-
it, they're not part of the family.
Yeah.
They move on to the farm, they become a tenant farmer. In fact, they even take on that name if they were to.
Again,
So I often wonder that, tenant
And
farmers.
a lot of our Scandinavian ancestors moved to the United States because of the farming, the labor conditions. Right. Yeah, again, this is a philosophical conversation of, how do we define slave? The American definition of slave has been generally black people, right, who were kept in chains. When we talk about slavery in the Bible, so often modern Christianity has done mental and theological gymnastics to explain away why slaves weren't such a bad thing, etc. And that's a whole other conversation. And then when we approach something like slavery and native peoples of the Pacific Northwest, we want to say, well, but they did better than us Americans did. Slavery, which is literally the ownership of another human being, has been present throughout human history in pretty much every culture and society in different forms, right? Obviously, it's different here. You can make a pretty strong argument that somebody who lives in the United States of America in 2021, who's living paycheck to paycheck, who's being paid minimum wage, right, and has no social mobility, right, and can't afford to buy a home, which is generational wealth, you can make a pretty strong argument that there's not a huge distinction between that and somebody who's being owned. At least they're guaranteed to have shelter and food. Susan, go ahead.
Well, medical and dental students graduate with hundreds of thousands of
Dollars in student debt.
student loans.
Yeah.
So they're kind of indentured.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, and the reality is that we culturally define slavery in a way that not benefits, but it's easier for us to
And
benefit.
it gets dicey when you combine the racial
Yes,
divide.
yes.
And that's for a whole other conversation.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and then just the generational effects of poverty and how that affects people culturally and whatnot. It's
Well, if you get into cultures where women aren't allowed to work.
literally, yeah, right. And that, I mean, this is a biblical reality too. Is that, and we've never shied away from this, is that women were essentially property, especially in the Levitical understanding of how women fit. Oh, which is okay. This will take 1 minute. Regarding gender roles, there was a pretty significant gender role divide in that men did the fishing and hunting, women did the gathering. So women collected berries, they dug up camas root, they dug up opato. But there was some very interesting overlap, which defines their gender roles significantly different than perhaps historical European gender role sensibilities. And that men would participate in things like weaving and clothes making and stuff like this because they didn't have the benefit of an industrialized society, right? So if you have winter approaching, the salmon run has ended, and you need to get the fish dry, you need to get new clothes made, you need to get new curtains, you need to get new bedclothes, whatever. They're not going to sit there and go, well, that's women's work. I'm just going to sit on my butt all day because we've got enough elk killed. No, they did what they needed to be done. So in terms of gender roles, they did have specific jobs. Women generally did this while the men were fishing. The women were doing this. It was much more practical than.
Well, they made the tools too.
Yes, but there was some interplay between that as well too. Especially when it came to like hunting instruments and stuff like that, the men would generally do their own. Canoe production was usually a all people involved thing. Both women and men were involved in the making of canoes. It was a very involved process. Canoes were another form of generational wealth. I mean, dude, talk about a tough thing to manufacture. Imagine making a canoe out of red cedar bark and pitch and all that stuff, and trusting your life on something. Thanks. Does somebody else have? I don't know. My eyes are glazing over. Well, that's it for today, folks. Thank you so much. If I forgot to repost the books, my reading list, I'll try to remember to do that again next week. I'm 99% sure I'll be here next week. So what we're going to do next week is do a little bit more of talking about the setting, but we'll begin to talk about what happens when the European folks arrive and how that impacts life. Sound good?
I'll send one.
Yes.